I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement for the people who live in our study area currently and formerly, especially the indigenous group of the Basarwa people. Human-elephant conflict, or HEC, is a detrimental and pervasive issue that disproportionately impacts socioeconomically vulnerable communities. It can be highly dangerous and destructive, particularly for rural farming communities. On the right-hand side, you can see sorghum and sweet reed crops in Northwest Botswana that have been damaged and consumed by elephants. HEC not only has immediate impacts like the destruction of these crops, but also damage to property, life-threatening injuries to people and elephants. But studies have also shown that HEC can lower overall community tolerance for wildlife conservation for all species, and can also undermine support for conservation and sustainable land use practices. To understand the ecological and social context of HEC and to predict future trends, while also developing sustainable methods of coexistence, there must be a strong understanding of spatio-temporal patterns and trends. But what if these patterns and data do not exist or are incomplete? We examine these issues in the Western Okavango Panhandle, which is in the northwest corner of Botswana. Most residents here rely on subsistence agriculture for nutrition and livelihoods, and they have some of the lowest income levels in the country. Northern Botswana is also home to the largest savanna elephant population in the continent, which often leads to HEC. However, these dynamics have never been formally studied in the Western Panhandle. On the right side, you can see an aerial view of the Western Panhandle. And in the distance, you can see the water of the Okavango Delta. And up closer is the fields and settlements that farmers have. So when elephants come to reach the river and the water, they must cross through villages and fields. And on the left side is an example of a very common form of fencing, which is the stick and pole method. And this is primarily to keep out smaller and medium-sized wildlife, as well as free-ranging livestock. Data from standardized elephant population monitoring are also scarce in the Panhandle. The two most recent studies of population estimation were in 2004 and 2013. So we can see that generally there is an increasing trend in elephant population. However, any fluctuations in between those years are very hard to decipher. And the most recent census of humans living in the Western Panhandle has shown a sharp increase in population size. In order to quantify and characterize HEC in the Western Panhandle, we used a mixed methods approach that incorporated both quantitative longitudinal conflict data and firsthand perspectives from the residential farmers, as well as a case study of detailed HEC inspections within 1 year. We transcribed and cleaned written reports of HEC incidents from regional offices of the Botswana Department of Wildlife and National Parks, or DWNP, from 2008 to 2016. The DWNP collects data on all human-wildlife conflict types for compensation for farmers for any damaged crops, property, livestock. And farmers must travel to one of two offices in the far north or far south of the Panhandle in order to file these reports. And next, we surveyed 40 farmers in the village of Namasere at the end of the growing season in 2016. Our questions were both closed and open-ended and covered topics that were objective, like the number of past HEC incidents and conflict mitigation techniques, as well as subjective questions, such as their feelings on living with elephants. This local ecological knowledge provided both greater depth and nuance to our understanding of conflict trends, and was also able to extend the scope of our studies back to the 1990s. And finally, within our case study year, we conducted detailed field rate assessments in 8 villages throughout 2016. We collected information on field characteristics, damage levels and types, and demographics of the raiding elephants. With this mixed methods approach, we revealed many interesting trends and characteristics both in the long term and short term. First, there was a significant increasing trend in reported HEC incidents from 2008 to 2016. A majority of incidents were related to crop raiding, and conflict displayed a strong seasonality, with most conflict occurring in the wet season and peaking during intermediate and mature crop growth stages. As you can see here, HEC types that include purely crop damage, as well as damage to crops and property, make up the majority of reported incidents. And the most commonly consumed crop type when available was millet, which is a very important staple grain. And when comparing the northern portion of our study area to the southern portion, we saw a much steeper increase over time in reported conflicts in the north. And this trend was also reflected in our single case year study in 2016, where slightly more than half of all HEC reports were in the northern portion. And these are some quotes from farmers on their perspectives. And most farmers had observed HEC and elephant populations as having increased since the 1990s. Most farmers described negative feelings towards living with elephants. And this sentiment is alarming because it could foreshadow an erosion of support for conservation and potentially a motivation for poaching. We found that between each year, there was a variation in the number of raids occurring at the village scale. As you can see here, the top 5 villages with the highest levels of HEC during our study period change every year. And again, we saw this pattern in 2016, where both the number and level of raiding, as well as the intensity of crop raiding, varied per village. And we also learned from farmers during 2016 that a third of them had experienced an incident of 100% damage to fields since 2010. And within just the 2016 growing season, over half of farmers experienced at least 3 human-elephant conflict incidents. And this recurring type of damage really lowers the resilience of a field to be able to grow crops that can either support farmers for their nutrition or for their livelihoods economically for selling cash crops. When looking at our case study in 2016, we found several other striking patterns, particularly in the differences between male and female elephant raids. Groups of bull elephants were responsible for a majority of crop raiding incidents. And there was also a spatial variation between the northern and southern portion of our study areas. More than 80% of HEC attributed to male groups occurred in the north, and most of the HEC attributed to female groups occurred in the south. This may be explained by the fact that the southern portion of the Panhandle has more marshy island grassland habitat, which elephants who are raising offspring or have younger members in their herds have been observed fleeing towards during damage or any type of conflict for reasons revolving around safety and protection of their young. And although they were responsible for fewer incidents, crop raiding by female groups resulted in higher levels of total and proportional damage to fields, which means that any single raid by a female herd of elephants is more likely to cause acute damage to fields than male groups. We also found, interestingly, that female groups had related injuries to livestock during their crop raiding at about a rate of 45% of incidents compared to about a quarter of male raids having injuries to livestock. So this is an additional stressor to farmers' food security and income. And again, male and female elephant groups do have some similarities when it comes to fields that they choose to raid. So a majority of male and female raids occurred in fields that had been previously raided since 2010. And of these fields that had been previously raided, a majority had been raided within the last year. So this information suggests that it's important to understand local variation in elephant demographics to predict and respond to different levels of damage caused by male and female groups. And in these quotes, you can see that many farmers noted that there are changes in the demographics of elephants that were raiding their crops. And overall, the message was where they once had lone bulls who were raiding, they were seeing more raids carried out by female herds, sometimes with calves. When looking at the methods that farmers used to protect their fields, we saw that most farmers used fencing and staying in their fields overnight, as well as making noise to deter elephants. However, these were not seen as 100% effective or the best method. And interestingly, we did not see many farmers who responded that chilies were commonly used. However, a higher proportion of farmers thought that this was a beneficial method for protecting crops. And no farmers responded that beehive fences were something that they used or that they saw as useful. And both of these methods are used to protect fields across Africa and Asia and are highly effective. So this could be an important gap to address within conservation methods. And finally, we found that there were high levels of reporting of these incidents of human-elephant conflict to the DWMP, but very low trust and follow through. So while a majority of farmers were reporting incidents, only about a quarter actually received follow-up assessments from the DWMP. You can see in these quotes that there are issues with trust and follow through. And we believe that because of these inherent issues around compensation schemes and reporting and any bias from people who live closer to reporting stations, the level of human-elephant conflict reported from 2008 through 2016 is likely a conservative estimate, and it can show the directional magnitude of conflict, but we believe that it, again, is an underestimate. And some other potential issues with our data are that we had only surveyed fields across 8 villages compared to their several other villages within the Western Panhandle. And our interviews came from a single village within one growing season. So in the future, it would be great to expand this to other villages to get an even more nuanced perspective of what happens where. In conclusion, we found that there is an escalation of human-elephant conflict frequency in the Western Panhandle. And it is complex and differs in timing, location, severity, and type. And we have multiple data sources that support these findings. This heterogeneity makes it important to understand the location-specific details and implications of HEC in order to best mitigate it. And finally, we found that there is a strong value of a mixed methods approach to incorporating local ecological knowledge in these understudied regions. And this relates in terms of both giving you a reliable long-term measurement when you might not have that long-term monitoring data from people's perspectives. And it also added many more dimensions to our understanding of the impacts of conflict on people. Our next steps are to publish these results officially, as well as developing resources for our partner organization, eCoexist, and the DWMP in order to improve our understanding and response to HEC in the Western Panhandle. And for me and for others involved in the study to continue applying this mindset of mixed methods to research and conservation projects. And already I have incorporated this approach into projects I'm conducting in Northern Kenya. It's a very helpful way to expand the typical data sources we look at. I just wanted to acknowledge some of our partners and assistants. We couldn't do without them. And now I'm going to open it up to questions. Thank you so much for joining this talk.